Good morning again, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. Again, thank you for joining us. My name is Jenny Cohen. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Baltimore and one of the co-founders of the CARP Research Lab. I'm going to introduce our speakers today and then turn the conversation over to them. I'm going to ask that you all remain muted, if you would, so that we can hear our speakers as best we can. And when we turn it over to the Q&A, we'll ask you to type your questions into the chat box so that our moderator can share them with our guest speaker. Quickly, a little bit about CARP. We're a loose collection of international and interdisciplinary scholars studying character and character assassination in politics, science, and entertainment. And we'll hear certainly a great deal about both politics and when politics crosses over into entertainment today. We host conferences dedicated to the subject, publish scholarship, and teach courses, workshops, and seminars related to these topics. We're hosting these webinars during summer of 2020 as a way to promote a handbook that we recently released with Routledge Press called the Routledge Handbook of Character Assassination and Reputation Management, which the CARP co-founders and I edited and got scholarship from a wide variety of some of our affiliated scholars, including the speaker that we have today, who published a chapter in the Routledge Handbook with his co-author Bob Lichter about late night television and ridicule and the way that it relates to character. So let me quickly introduce him before I turn over the conversation. Oh, one last note. We'll have some more upcoming webinars as we move into the fall. So for more details, follow us on Twitter at @carp_lab and you'll get the latest details about that. But I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker today, who's Dr. Steven Farnsworth from the University of Mary Washington, our sort of neighboring scholars here in the DMV. He is a professor and the director of the Center for Leadership and Media Studies. He focuses on mass media, the presidency, and Virginia politics in a wide variety of research that he has published. He's the author of 7 books. I've just gathered a couple of them that are most relevant to our conversation today, including Presidential Communication and Character, The Global President, Spinner-in-Chief. So we can see kind of his focus on the media and its relation to politics today. He's also authored dozens of academic articles related to these topics. So we're delighted to have a conversation with him today. So I'm going to hand the conversation over to Sergei Samoilenko, who will get our conversation with Dr. Farnsworth started. So I will stop sharing my screen and mute myself and hand it over. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jennifer. Can you hear me well? Wonderful. All right, so I'm delighted to introduce Steve Farnsworth and welcome him to our discussion. And I've known Steve for many years when he used to work at George Mason University, and we used to have all this conversation about presidential character back then. So before we even launched CARP 3 years ago, so one of the most interesting discussions we had with Steve was about the declining importance of character, as I used to point out, because a lot of research, especially by Martin Wattenberg, indicates that the chances of presidential image makers now basically declined. So presidential character is not as important as in the times of Johnson, Nixon, Reagan. The public sees politicians to be generally unreliable. The trust in political institutions is down. And in the United States, as we know, voters choose more to identify with the party agenda and support the candidates of their party regardless of accusations against them. So therefore, they often choose some unreliable person who shows most support for the personal interests. So commonality of interest becomes more important than any other criteria. So Steve, my first question to you would be, why should we talk about character today in 2020?
Well, I would well, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so delighted to be here to talk with you all about my interest in presidential communication and character. I think the research that talks about how powerful political parties are and the determination of how individuals vote is basically a standard North Star of election studies in the United States. We go back to 1960 and the American voter. Everybody understands that political party identification is the key central identification that people have to the political system. It transcends who the candidates are, it transcends the issues on the table, and so on. That's true for about 90% of the electorate, the people who care the most about politics. What's important about character, I think, can be distilled in sort of two places. First of all, there is the issue of presidential character as it relates to those voters who are not clearly identified with one party or another. So for about 10% of the electorate, political parties don't matter much. They don't really think about politics. They don't really think about parties. They may or may not vote. And so you have to figure out a way to reach those people. And if party messages don't work, you can count on issue measures, which also wouldn't work because these are people who don't care that much about politics. They don't care that much about outcomes. So how do you reach those people? And the way that you reach those people is through character. Now, there's clearly a dynamic where almost everybody has already decided who they're going to vote for. I think that's particularly true in 2020. But when you think about those people who haven't decided, the sliver, 10% or so, they're not really interested in politics. One of the ways that you reach them is through character. And if you look at how Biden is campaigning, that's exactly how he's campaigning, presenting himself as an adult in the room, presenting himself as a competent professional, somebody who has the integrity to do the job. The second point I'd make just quickly is that it's important to remember that presidential governance is a very different environment than presidential elections. When you think about what these people do once they're elected, you see public opinion being much, much more fluid. In the case of Obama, for example, his approval ratings went from mid-40s or so at the low point, right around the time the Affordable Care Act passed, to a high of about 70% when he first took office. And with George W. Bush, you also saw a range from about 25 at the end of his presidency to about 90 right after 9/11. Now, Trump is unusual. He's very flat. His approval ratings in the low 40s across all 4 years so far. But make no mistake about it, that kind of fluidity, you also, as a president and presidential image making, are trying to present yourself through character. And this is also true in the reverse. That is, the people who are trying to undermine a presidential candidate, undermine a president, are also using character measures, assessments of character, talking about character to try to bring that president down.
Serge, you're still muted.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Steve. I kind of knew what you would say about this because we discussed this thing many times before. So then the question is, so what is the most important factor to focus on during campaigns when you try to promote your characters? Remember 3 years ago when we had our first CARP conversation, Thomas McCloskey had this nice paper showing that political leaders who can establish authenticity against their rivals perceived as better political candidates. Like, for example, he argued that during the 2016 presidential election, Trump's strategy was to abandon character altogether and instead focus entirely on being authentic. So even if that meant being authentically terrible. So, but showing authenticity and consistency of this authenticity was his main strategy. So what's your opinion about this authenticity factor as a key criterion for the election campaigns?
Well, I think that is a key issue. I think people really do see through artifice or fraud. When a person in public life presents themselves in a way that they're not really, that's a really impossible task. Remember, in today's media, these politicians are subject to scrutiny virtually all day long. It's an exhausting task to run for office. Imagine how tiring it would be to do what these people do. And for many of us, they're people quite a bit older than we are who are doing this. And so to imagine a 70-year-old version of ourselves bouncing around from Iowa to Arizona to Ohio, and then back for more day after day is pretty astonishing. So if you try to present yourself in a way that you're not, I don't think that works very well because it's discovered, I think, pretty quickly that you're not who you say you are. Now, when I think of character in terms of my own research, I do not necessarily think of character as naturally a sort of a good thing. That is, that it's a, character is not just that I'm moral. It can be character being that I'm a tough guy, that I'm an SOB or whatever. It is how you present yourself. And in the case of the 2016 campaign, I think Trump quite reasonably recognized that Hillary Clinton had high negatives. And so the way to deal with his own high negatives is to bring up her negatives even more. And so it isn't that you have to be seen as a good person in any kind of moral sense. You just have to be seen as somebody who connects with voters in a way about who you are that they respect. And also, if you can, make the other candidate look even worse. Because in our two-party system, you only have to finish first. You don't have to be 50% positive. Trump has never, so far in his presidency, been 50% positive. But he's president and Hillary Clinton is not.
So, Steve, is it true that all the discussions about character basically boil down to the importance of impression management? And this is really important because political campaigns in other countries in Europe are different than political campaigns here. So in the United States political context, what do you think of impression management being the kind of the key criterion for basically character establishment? So in other words, and I also would like to know what is your perception about charisma, because some research showed that charismatic leaders better have chances to be, elected, because they have better chance of kind of showing their character through some self-presentation techniques.
Well, I think it's important to remember that our political system is so different from so many others. If you're thinking about a parliamentary system and electing a prime minister, it isn't just that you're voting for the prime minister. You're voting for the individual member of the prime minister's party in your constituency. And so that has all kinds of impacts too. And so we have a much more personalized politics in the United States compared to, say, European parliamentary democracies. And that means that there is much more focus. Another thing to remember as well is that the United States is a huge country. And so media impacts are so much greater here, not only because of the personalization of our politics, but also the immensity of the nation that you're talking about. I mean, when you think about how many people have actually met a presidential candidate or met somebody who's met a presidential candidate or spent any time with them, that's a tiny, tiny sliver of the electorate. And so what you see about these politicians is through the media. There is almost no real president behind that kind of presentation. And that's, I think, a key issue. And that's one of the reasons why I think modern presidents, regardless of the media environment, focus so much on this presentation of themselves. I mean, if you think about George W. Bush and the way he used Fox News, or Barack Obama and the way he used social media, in particular YouTube and Facebook, you think about how President Trump, who's a master of Twitter, it doesn't really matter that much about the media environment of the day. They're all going in the same direction. And while it's true, it doesn't necessarily win you a lot of votes. Having people feel more positively about you while you're president can be very, very useful in terms of getting over the finish line with those sort of tough policy issues that are out there. The Affordable Care Act passed under Obama by a narrow margin. And the Affordable Care Act repeal under Trump failed by a narrow margin. And part of the reason I think that it failed was that a lot of those individual Republicans who defied the president in the Senate, they felt like Trump's evaluation in the country wasn't sufficiently high that they had to worry about that. Or their concern for the country and their vision of themselves and how they present themselves to the public and how they see themselves as people, again, stood in the way of just doing what the president wanted. So our system is very centralized and very media focused, and that's one of the reasons why we do it this way. It may not add up to a lot of votes in the end, but it can be decisive. And particularly when you're talking about presidential governance, big policy wins and losses in this country are entirely at the narrow margins of a vote here or a vote there.
Okay, wonderful. So that's really important that you also mentioned the some appeals to policy, because there's some debate in research about the importance of character attacks versus policy attacks. So Will Benoit in the 90s actually studied a lot of presidential campaigns, and basically he came up with like 3 main things that politicians do. And he said, well, they basically, regardless of debate, they do three things. They actually praise themselves, they attack others, and they defend themselves against other people's attacks. So in the American context, we know that character assassination is as American as an apple pie. So based on kind of your research and your experience, would you say that the magnitude of character assassination has increased in recent years, or has it been always the same?
Well, I think if we look back to the early days of the American Republic, you can see a pretty nasty stretch of political attacks in that first generation. You know, we've popularized it through Hamilton, but the reality is that these are people who were just as combative with each other as what we see today. The attacks in the newspapers of the day of the early 1800s are vicious, even by the standards of the personal attacks today. So I don't know that we have really sort of evolved or devolved. I think there are just periods of time where politicians are finding it particularly useful to be nastier, and periods of time when they're finding it not so useful. I think that one of the big changes in American politics that we're still sort of grappling with is the end of the Cold War. I mean, there was a bipartisan consensus, really, fundamentally, about how important dealing with the Soviet Union was. There was a fundamental agreement among Democrats and Republicans that a tough stand is a key mechanism. And so the disputes with the Democrats and the Republicans in the past were not nearly as pervasive and all-encompassing as they are today. So I think if you were to look at this, you can think of it more like tides going in and going out. And so I think there are times when there's a lot of nastiness, like there was, say, in the 1850s before the Civil War, during the early days of the Republic, and today, and then periods of time where there wasn't so much. There was almost immediately after the generation of Jefferson and Hamilton, you had the era of good feelings in American politics in the early 1800s. And then, of course, the Cold War environment, I think, led to a great deal of consensus among political figures. But now, when you have parties in the United States that are much more ideologically coherent, you don't have those conservative Southern Democrats who kept the Democratic Party from being all that far and to the left, and you had moderate New England Republicans a generation ago that kept the Republican Party from being all that negative in the right. You saw those sort of barriers on extremism disappearing. And that means that decisions are being made in primaries where the most extreme Democrat and the most extreme Republican are likely to be the choices that you end up with in a general election. But you also have a different media environment where this kind of personal attack is really, really intensified, if anything, by the social media of today, by Fox News, by those venues where you can go and say whatever you want and basically not be subject to serious fact-checking and accountability. Add it all up, and it's a great environment to be a character assassin.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So speaking of today's time, in the context of social media and globalization and overall increased visibility, we know that the perception of character across the world has changed, and a lot of traditional norms and perceptions, including perceptions of gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, have been challenged. And so, for example, a notable trend right now, it's changing social norms and communication habits about masculinity, right? You've probably heard the term detoxifying masculinity or toxic masculinity. So can we talk about how the perceptions of character have changed, and whether you've seen any type of conflicts right now that maybe relate to some value clash between baby boomers and Generation X and younger generations?
Well, my initial reaction is we're seeing it on the streets of this country every day. I think that fundamentally there is, with this this moment in which we find ourselves, a pretty intense disagreement over the way forward. If you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, if you look at the demonstrations, I happen to be in Virginia, and so we have seen a significant number of statues, Confederate statues, and meet their end in recent weeks. And so there really is a clear sense that there is I guess I'll use the word idealism among today's young people, that America can be better. America should be better. The police should handle things better. And any commemoration of the past, that's problematic if it is a past that celebrates the Civil War, Confederacy, the white supremacy, and so on. So I think what you're seeing is really a sense of frustration. And this is not unusual in the American system. I mean, if I think about I was born in the 60s, so I wasn't part of it, but the 1960s radicals and the efforts to try to end the war and the efforts for civil rights, and you look at those kinds of politics of, say, 2 generations ago, you know, there's something very similar there. And if you think about the ideas about curbing corporate power of a century ago, you know, the trust busters of the turn of the century between the 1890s and the early 1900s, you know, again, you see those moments. And so I think what's important to recognize, particularly for the members of the conversation who are not Americans, is that America is a revolutionary society. Our political institutions were built by revolutionaries. And so we are much more oriented towards change than most societies. I mean, think about how you get to be a prime minister in a Westminster democracy. You have to go through all this time in opposition, in shadow government, in maybe a lower level cabinet position before you go through peer evaluation saying, okay, this is the person we want to represent all of us. In America, all you have to do is get a few thousand more votes in Iowa than somebody else, and boom, you're a contender. And that's what happens. I mean, it's inconceivable that any country would pick somebody outside of their parliament to be their leader. And that, of course, is exactly what we've done in the United States. Now, that can be a good thing, right? I mean, we're more open to new ideas than any other country that I can think of that has this kind of established democracy. But we're also really willing to take a chance. And sometimes when you let me say it this way. Sometimes when you gamble with a lot of money on the table with high stakes, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And so that's the nature of it. But, you know, we also have frequent elections. So if we make a mistake, we can correct it.
Excellent. It's an excellent point. So I would like to give you the floor and let you talk a little bit about your current research. I know you completed several impressive books in recent years. And especially, I would like you to talk about your research with Bob Lichter about political satire and about the use of ridicule as a character assassination tool.
Sure. Let me just I'll share screen here and I'll show you a few PowerPoint slides, and then we can resume the conversation. One point I want to make about how important character assassination is as an attack strategy is the way in which the conservatives attacked President Obama for his religion, arguing that he wasn't one of us by talking about how he wasn't really a Christian. Now, the fact of the matter is that Obama was a Christian. He regularly took family to church, and he sometimes had the cameras there so that people knew what he was. I don't know that he was as aggressive about it as he should have been, but certainly this was one of the ways in which the attacks on Obama not being one of us really had significant impact. These are Pew Surveys. The first column deals with the question of whether or not people thought Obama was a Christian. And the second column is the change from the same question being asked in March of '09. So this is basically 2 months into the Obama presidency versus a year and a half in. And this is a time, of course, when Obama has been president this whole period, so he has huge opportunities to shape the narrative through the media control that presidents already have. As Lichter and I have discussed in other works, 2/3 of the news coverage of government is focused on the president, sometimes more than that in moments of crisis. But what's important here is the extent to which, not so much that the character assassination convinced people that Obama was a Muslim, although there is some evidence of that, it's much more that people were less certain that he was a Christian. And so I think one of the key things to remember about misinformation or character assassination is that the goal isn't always to convince people of something that's false, but rather to make them think that something that's true might not be true after all. And so if you look at this, even among Obama's core supporters, people who identified as Democrats, people who are African American, you saw significant declines in people thinking that Obama was still a Christian after 18 months of narratives that he might not be on conservative media. Similarly, you see an increase in number of people who think that he's Muslim, and of course the effective gains were strongest among those people who would be more inclined to watch Fox News, be more inclined to be conservative in their politics, and of course more whites than African Americans saw this increase. And then of course there's the don't know that significantly increases across the conversation. So this pattern, I think, really speaks to the extent to which you want to play defense more perhaps than Obama did on this key issue, because all you really needed to do was go outside and stand in front of a church. Maybe not using tear gas to get there. Obama wouldn't have needed to do that, but doing more of that would have been, I think, helpful to him, because once people start thinking he's not one of us, and that was the strategy of Republicans' opponents, it's harder and harder for Obama to govern. We saw, of course, not much longer after the August of 2010 survey, a significant decline in the Democrats' ability to win in that midterm election of 2010. That's when the Democrats lost the House. I just want to show a couple of slides about a survey that I really liked from Gallup that dealt with these questions of character concerns and Trump disapproval. I have two slides relating to Trump, one disapproval, one approval. So this is based on the 56% of the people who disapproved of Trump. Notice how high the level is here of opposition to Trump based on personality and personal characteristics. Again, I think when we're thinking about governance, we're looking at something very different than elections in terms of the impact of party identification. And so a huge dynamic here at the basis of Trump's opposition based on who he is as a person. Now, if you compare that to Obama or Bush during similar points in their presidencies, you really don't see the same kind of dynamic. And so Trump really has emphasized character and personality much more than Obama or Bush did. In many ways, they were looking at specific policy issues. And if you look at the individual comments that people made, I've marked with an asterisk the ones that really have significant personality components. This, by the way, I think speaks to why Trump never seems to do much better in the polls in the low 40s. The people who disapprove of him for his very core identity. And that's something that's really hard to change. If you look at the people who approve of Trump, this is based on 38% of those who approved of Trump in this survey, you see personality doesn't matter as much. That now you're looking much more about, I think he's doing a good job, the best he can under circumstances that are unfavorable. He's doing what the American public wants, and so on. Now, when you're looking at those kinds of numbers, you can see that may not be as fixed as the opposition. But in the highly partisan environment of today, you really do see a significant inflexibility, if you will, in approval numbers relating to the president. I mean, certainly everything we'd learned about public opinion before Trump would have told us, hey, when the economy is really doing well, approval numbers for the president will go way up. When COVID strikes and America is in a lockdown and there's this economic devastation, I don't think there's any other way to put it, there would be a huge decline. But there hasn't been all that much of an impact. Sure, it's been negative for Trump, and his numbers are worse now than they've been. But still, he's nowhere near where Bush was, say, in 2008, where approval ratings were in the 25-point range. And then I know you wanted me to talk a little bit about political humor. This is some data from Late Night with Trump, another book that I've gotten out recently. Trump has been great for book writers, I guess. I have two of them now related to Trump. But what you can see, and I'll draw your attention to the number for Donald Trump, the number of jokes about Donald Trump. What we have here are jokes that relate to the late night comedy shows, the three network shows, and the Daily Show on Comedy Central. And so you can see that in Obama's first year, there were 936 jokes about him. That's enough to rank number one, but it's pretty small compared to Trump. 3,100 jokes during his first year in office as president. And of course, during the presidential campaign, 1,800 jokes there. 3 times as much as Hillary Clinton, and significantly higher than John McCain in 2008, or George Bush, or even Bill Clinton and George H.W. Bush going back. So what you see here is this is a conversation that is increasingly impactful in our politics, particularly for younger voters. People who are watching the late night comedy, some of them, about a quarter of them, say they find some political information that they learn. And this, again, speaks to those voters who are not sort of reflexively Republicans or Democrats. They're not political junkies. And in many ways, perhaps these late night comedy is sort of like the old saying that it's a spoonful of sugar helping the medicine of politics go down. You know, that there is some sort of dynamic here where people who may not care a lot about politics, but feel they need to know at least a little bit, will go to these late night comedy shows. And of course, the conversation here, once again, is also highly character-based. The conversation about Trump is not really about the Affordable Care Act in many of these cases, although obviously with Jimmy Kimmel, he talked about that a good deal, but rather about who he is as a person, the corruption, the family dramas, the issues with respect to all the rallies and the Trump supporters and so on. So there is a very character-focused dimension to late-night comedy. And so to the extent that people are using late-night comedy as at least one of their information sources, we once again are drawn back to this idea that there is a significant issue of reputation management, character assassination, when you're thinking about late-night comedy. I think one of the things that is problematic for Trump is who he is here, because he just doesn't take a joke. You know, if you think about Ronald Reagan, you know, when people made fun of Ronald Reagan not knowing what was going on, because maybe he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, he said, he dropped his papers one time and he says, it doesn't even matter what order they're in. I'll just talk and then I'll answer the questions. You know, he made a joke about it. When, you know, Lincoln, maybe it's an apocryphal story, but when Lincoln was accused of being two-faced, he said, if I were two-faced, why would I use this one? It's not so pretty, you know? And so if you can laugh at yourself, that is a significant advantage when you're dealing with late night comedy or with the Will Rogers or other comedians of the day in the pre-television age. But for Donald Trump, he simply cannot do it. He's incapable about it. And so every time he complains about the Alec Baldwin imitation on Saturday Night Live, the ratings for Saturday Night Live go up, the attention paid to Alec Baldwin goes up. He is, in many ways, the gift that keeps on giving for late night comedy. And so with that, I'll take the screen share back, and we can resume the conversation.
Thank you, Steve. It's really enlightening. So yes, we do have first questions. And let me start with a question from Mark Young. He's asking whether you think the post-Trump time will bring in some time of cohesion in politics or more division, while a lot of might go with the Trumpism, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think that what happens next will depend, I think, to a great measure on the 2020 election itself. If this turns out to be a close election, you can imagine a lot of the people who support Trump say that good message, bad messenger. And so they might very well say that another Trump-style politician should be the Republican standard going forward. If Trump and Republicans, and this is more important, the Republicans in the House and the Senate get clobbered, then they might think about the need to go in a new direction. I mean, you know, Harry Truman famously said that you don't learn much being kicked a second time by a mule. And so the reality is that if you are thinking about this environment as a Republican, you want to know, how do I survive? How does this work for me? And if the strategy of sort of supporting Trump and you still get reelected works, then maybe you won't be inclined to think about a different strategy. But if this is a major repudiation of the Republican Party in November, and certainly the polls are not very favorable for a lot of Republicans in close Senate races right now, that's going to suggest the need to move in a different direction. And you're already seeing that. I mean, if you look at in nearby Maryland, Larry Hogan, a Republican who has had his significant differences with Trump, is talking a lot about the 2024 election and a different vision for the Republican Party going forward. Because ultimately, the big problem that the Republican Party has is reaching beyond its base. That's the real challenge they're facing in the era of Trump. Trump is very good at criticizing and attacking his opponents, but he's not so good at making people feel good about being a Republican and making them feel good about supporting other Republicans. Trump as a political movement is Trump first, second, and third, and that's a significant problem for these other Republicans. And so how they make that work, I think is going to depend on how they handle things. But it's important to remember there are other factors here. As long as Fox News is out there, as long as gerrymandering is as effective and powerful as it is, you're going to create environments where winning a party nomination and providing an extreme partisan message are the best ways to succeed in politics. And politicians are looking at this environment and saying, I want to be on Fox News, and I don't get it on Fox News by being a moderate. I want to be supported by the president. I want him to show up at rallies in Tulsa or wherever, and I don't get that by being a moderate. And so for the moment, I think that the Republican Party has been joined at the hip with Trump. Whether that connection stays with Trumpism post-Trump, whether that's in the 2020 environment or 2024, well, I think that depends on the level of repudiation. If it's close, I think Trumpism without Trump lives to fight another day.
Thank you. There's a question from Marlene Laruelle, our handbook contributor. Do you consider that the current utopia of full transparency of political life and politicians in their personal life can improve democracy, or would it open the door to forms of totalitarian control? Or can it be both at the same time?
Well, my first reaction is that in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, I'm not sure we really do have full transparency in this country. I think that when you're looking at a presidential environment where we don't have answers to fundamental questions like how much does Trump owe the Russians? What exactly were the conditions that he used to get loans from Deutsche Bank? What are these kinds of questions? Now, we don't know. Maybe everything is benign. But what is clear is that over 4 years, as a presidential candidate and as president, Trump has used every tool at his disposal to make sure we don't know anything about his personal business. We also look at this in extraordinary contrast to previous presidents, where presidential candidates of both parties going back to the post-Watergate years, going back 40 years, have been very, very transparent about these questions. As much as the Clintons were attacked for their financial chicaneries and in the years in public life, their tax returns were all public. So it's important to remember that that when we talk about transparency, we have a ways to go with respect to that. I'm a former journalist. I was a reporter for 10 years before I became an academic, so I'm never going to say transparency is bad. So I'm going to start from that point. I just fundamentally feel like the more we know about these people, the better we can determine whether or not they're the ones that we want. And I think that if we go down the road of saying that they can limit the discussion about certain aspects of their lives, we're on a fool's errand. First of all, in the United States, it won't be successful. There are too many investigative reporters. There's too much information. We all live such extraordinarily documented lives, especially now, that you really can't hide much. And so even if you tried, you wouldn't succeed, because there is always going to be a far left or far right media to burst whatever narrative bubble you want to put forward if the opposing campaign doesn't have the means or capacity to do it themselves.
Thank you, Steve. Jennifer Cohen wonders, you mentioned how Biden is campaigning on character. I'm curious, given what you know about political communication, what you would advise Biden to do as the campaign continues.
Well, I think Biden is doing it exactly right. In some ways, the Biden campaign strategy from his house is ideal for Biden. If you look at his previous political campaigns, they weren't very successful, in part because he was out there in public, I would argue, more than was optimal for his campaigns. And so he would say things that he would live to regret, and he would have to sort of follow up and correct the narrative. And if you're explaining, you're losing in politics. And Biden has had in previous campaigns to do a lot of explaining. I think COVID is horrible and tragic, but from the point of view of what it does for the Biden campaign strategy, having him speak primarily in video clips that can be taped or recreate taped if they're not effective the first time is a very, very useful strategy. I think that in many ways, the focus for the Biden campaign should be on Trump. Incumbent presidents, when they're running for re-election, it's really a referendum on how well or how poorly they've done. And so having Biden in the background is smart for Biden. Having Biden speak in ways that are controlled by media presentations and can be retaped, that's also smart for Biden. Talking about Trump and his shortcomings, that's also smart for Biden. Biden is turning out to be a kind of a tough target for Trump to hit. He talked about sleepy Joe Biden. That didn't really take. He talked about creepy Joe Biden. That didn't really take. He talked about corrupt Joe Biden with all the issues with Ukraine. That didn't really take. And so over and over again, Trump has been searching for that magic narrative bullet, the soundbite, if you will, or the sound bark, I guess, that gives us a reason to dislike Joe Biden. And he hasn't found it yet. And that's been, I think, in part exacerbated by the COVID situation. So I think that that Biden is a much tougher target to hit than Hillary Clinton, in all honesty. And in many ways, he is benefiting from this current media environment, and I think that is a very useful strategy. I mean, there's the old saying in politics: when a politician is shooting himself in the foot, get out of the way. And so, if the president's talking about ingesting bleach and opening up the country and then dealing with the consequences of that, these are things that can be useful to the Biden campaign, as tragic as they are to individual people. But the reality is that Trump is not handling COVID well. And it becomes increasingly clear over time that that's the case. So how about you not talk about yourself all that much, talk about the opponent. That's what Biden is doing, and it's very smart.
The next question is from Danny Selnick. Do you think that recent character assassination or character attacks affected Trump's number and let him kind of have his supporters steer away from him? Or do you think it worked other way around? So you've seen him being portrayed in a more negative light?
Well, I really think that it's a challenge to try to spin COVID. I think that that's a fundamental problem, pretending that everything's okay and having rallies and trying to reopen states and then seeing the numbers go up, saying that it's about testing why the numbers are going up. These are difficult narratives to sustain. And ultimately, when you're thinking about Trump's core supporters, these are people who are older, and they are at greater risk for severe complications if they acquire COVID. And so they're having their doubts. I mean, if you think about opening up Texas or Arizona or wherever, if people don't come to these restaurants, if they don't come to these bars, you haven't really turned the economy around in any significant way. And so I think that that's one of the challenges. I think most voters are fixed for partisan reasons, but certainly when you're thinking about those voters who might have, say, bounced back and forth between the parties over the years, there are some voters, particularly in the industrial Midwest, where they have supported Obama for economic reasons, and they supported Trump for economic reasons. They may very well find that the strategies and tactics that Trump has employed during the COVID crisis, which is also an economic crisis as well as a healthcare crisis, haven't been very effective. For most voters, if you're going to try to pull them away from their partisan identification, economic conditions are one of the key ways to do it.
So the next question is from our friend Eric Shiraev, who is actually wondering about the British election system, and he wonders, you have praised the British electoral system, and yet it has produced Corbyn and Johnson, which are terrifying figures for millions of British today. Don't you think that there always be those 30% of citizens who are unhappy with public officials and who are susceptible to accepting character attacks?
Well, I absolutely think that's true. Character attacks are effective pretty much everywhere they're employed around the world. The point that I was making about the British system is that there's a process of peer review. And that, I think, minimizes the really negative, unexpected consequences. It's not necessarily that you end up with better politicians. I think that that the case is that people will come up with decisions. But what's clear about Boris Johnson, whether you like him or not, is that he's been good for the Conservative Party. He's a winner. That strategy has worked for him. I mean, my personal views on Brexit aside, the truth is that the Conservative Party wanted to be in the majority, and guess what? Boris Johnson made that happen. I think that you see with Boris Johnson more or less what you expected from Boris Johnson's previous years in politics. I don't know that we saw a significant departure here. I think that's a sharp contrast from an unexperienced politician in the United States. I think when you're thinking about the 2016 election, you could have imagined that Donald Trump, well, he's not really all that conservative a Republican. He used to give money to Democrats. He's from New York. Not a lot of conservative Republicans in New York compared to Alabama. And so you could imagine at least some people who wanted to vote for Trump persuading themselves that he wasn't all that much of a departure. Maybe he's sort of like a blustery McCain. And so, you could imagine that in 2016 because there wasn't a track record with this man in public life that would have suggested otherwise. Now, you could look at his business records and his years in bankruptcy and all the rest and say, maybe he's not the man he says he is. But from the point of view of policy, you didn't really see all that much about Trump other than promises about what he would do. And that's very different than what you see in a lot of other countries where there is a track record about what it means to be a conservative, what it means to be labor, what it means to be a new Democrat. These definitions are very, very clear. And in the United States, it's very, very fluid. The Democratic Party is what Biden says it is. The Republican Party is what Trump says it is. And when there's somebody else, it's what they say it is. And so that flexibility is an asset to the American system. But certainly there is something to be said for peer review too. I mean, I don't know that either system is necessarily better than the other. They give us different outcomes. America, I would argue, is a high risk, high reward political environment. But it's also a high risk of defeat environment in terms of outcomes. So, we have those kinds of dynamics based on who we are. And that's part of our being a revolutionary society. I mean, Westminster democracies are great for societies that do not have revolutionaries building them, because that's why we have such openness in our society, because of the decisions that they made, knowing what they didn't want in 1776 and 1787.
Steve, you have lots of comments and questions today. So there is a long one from Rod Carveth. I'm just going to read his question. How do the Democrats fight against the myth of the Trump economy, the greatest, in quotes, economy ever?
Well, there is data that can be used. What's the unemployment rate? What's the GDP? What's the debt? There are all kinds of economic measures out there. Now, obviously, Trump always thinks that a number that doesn't look good for him is a fake number, but the reality is that these are government statistics. But it's also true that people are looking around. If you're a miner, say, if you're a coal miner, one of the things that Trump talked a lot about in terms of how he was going to be different from Hillary Clinton was that he would do what he would do for coal. Well, 4 years later, what has he done for coal? Not so much. You can say that he is going to have this impact of exports. And so, if you're thinking about, perhaps I would argue the most economically sensitive sector of the American economy is agriculture. And if you think about the trade war impacts with respect to exports, a key source of American health in those key Midwestern states, Iowa, Ohio, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Upper Peninsula, Michigan, you're looking at places that are very, very sensitive to agricultural environment problems, not because everybody's a farmer, but because how farming goes affects little small towns in terms of what happens at the hardware store, what happens at the grocery store and the town Dollar General or Walmart or whatever it might be. And so those things are all significant. And, you can't put a spin on that. If people are looking at their communities and they're saying, we've got people standing in line for hours to get food at the food bank, and we didn't have that 4 years ago. We've got all these people who don't have jobs. We've got all these teenagers who've moved who've gone to college, but now they can't go back to college because of a health crisis, or they graduated and they can't get a job or even an internship because everything is still shut down. I mean, those are realities that are going to be really hard to spin away. Now, obviously, if you're listening to certain media companies and you're seeing certain things online, you can live in a filter bubble. But that's not a majority. That's why Trump has never been above 50%, because his filter bubble is in the range of 40% of the electorate. That is what he has and can rely on. And it has always astonished me that Trump has not done more to try to bring those numbers up, that he hasn't done more to reach out to people who are not reflexively Republican to try to make them see a reason to support him. Because make no mistake about it, when you're talking about Confederate monuments, when you're talking about good people on both sides of the Charlottesville neo-Nazi riot, you are not talking to people who are uncertain about which president to support. That's just not a strategy to bring new people into your camp.
The next question is from Andrew Bowman, who is wondering about disinformation campaigns and the best way to combat them. So we talked about disinformation and misinformation a lot in the last few months. So what is your perspective on that?
Well, I think that when we're talking about disinformation, I really find it very useful for my own purposes to use the fact-checking services that are out there. The Post Fact Checker, PolitiFact, and there are others. But overall, you're looking at a lot of places where you can go to see a correction out there. And I think that's really, really useful. The only problem is that sometimes in our short attention span or half attention span media consumption, that it may not have the impact that it might. I mean, one of the things that we noticed, going back to the example I used about Obama's religion, is that people said, oh, wait a minute, yeah, I heard something about maybe Obama not being a Christian, because they had read some of the counter narratives about correcting the original comments about Obama being a Muslim and the like. This goes back to the birth certificate and Kenya and all the rest. But the reality is that there isn't a better solution. I mean, ultimately, falsehood is a rewarding thing for the people who spread it to do. It keeps their supporters in line. And the price of chasing after every falsehood rapidly favors the offense, not the defense. If you think about, the Washington Post, the fact checker there, they have a new book out, something like 17,000, 18,000, 19,000 falsehoods by President Trump. Imagine how many reporter hours are spent figuring out how to put together a story saying that well, basically white is white, that black is black, that red is red. That fact checking is an extraordinary commitment of time, and I compliment the journalists who do it. Unfortunately, it doesn't necessarily get the respect that it deserves, because so many people are inclined to say that if you are saying something critical of this political figure or that political figure, then it's not a valid comment because you're biased against that person. I think one of the sort of unpleasant realities of our current environment is this media credibility, that even when the reporters are trying to do a good job of getting to the bottom of things and trying to investigate things, their extraordinary work is simply dismissed as fake news because it's unpleasant news, because it's not narrative confirming news. And, that's on us. I mean, our political system is as good or as bad as we make it. And if we're going to try to govern as citizens without evidence, or we're going to dismiss evidence because we have this blind partisan loyalty, well, we get the government we deserve. I mean, that's an unfortunate reality, but how can you make it otherwise in a democratic system? I mean, we're responsible. That's the whole point.
So we have lots of questions today, and too many that we can accommodate, unfortunately. So we have time just for one more, and then maybe we can conclude with some words of wisdom. So there is a question about, aside from your own books, which are brilliant, what other books on US presidential elections can you recommend?
Well, you know, there's a lot of great work that's being done by just some amazing scholars out there. My research tends to be in the area of political communication, and so I'm really most familiar with that. The last book that I read, which I really, really liked, was a book called Network Propaganda that basically looked at the conversations in various media environments during the 2016 campaign and the 2017 presidential election. It's a great new book that's out there, and I'd really recommend it. It's just such a thorough study of media. One of the big challenges of writing about media now is, what media are you writing about? There's so much out there, and this book does a great job of looking at not just the conventional media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the networks, Fox News, MSNBC, but also just individual bloggers and individual folks on Twitter and how those narratives are being constructed. And if you haven't done so, I really think it's essential as a citizen that you should read the Mueller report. That gets back to the questions of what's going on in this country and what was being done in the 2016. I mean, don't just take the president's word for it that there's nothing to it. That is a really interesting 400-page report. And for those of you who want the briefer version, my colleague Tom Patterson at Harvard has given an abridged version of the Mueller report that you can look at if you don't want the entire 400 pages. And so, you know, with those sort of key things to think about, you know, there's just an embarrassment of riches in research and political communication these days. It's become clearer and clearer to all of us who study this that the environment is becoming more media saturated and more influence for media than ever before in these different venues and channels. The challenge for us, though, is to figure out how to make sense of it all, because this is a universe expanding way faster than our capacity to follow along.
Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to speak to you again. And on this note, I would like to give the floor to Jennifer Cohen.
Thank you.
Well, I don't have anything else to say other than thank you, Dr. Farnsworth, for joining us today. It was a really lovely conversation. And, you know, I appreciate the way that you're able to put these larger conversations about Trump and his character in the context of the COVID crisis and its outward rippling economic effects and impacts. And I also, from my own personal note, really appreciate your hopeful tone, because sometimes it feels like there can be just too much, but it seems like you really are, not to put words in your mouth, optimistic about the ability to kind of reshape our politics and to learn more about the people who lead us. But otherwise, I would just say thank you to all of you asking great questions in the comments, and thank you to Dr. Farnsworth for joining us today.
Thanks, it was great. Great questions.